When examining the history of small nations since World War II, Syria emerges as uniquely significant, hosting one of the world's oldest civilizations and a rich cultural heritage. Since Saddam's fall in 2003, regions from the Middle East to Eastern Europe have witnessed the collapse of numerous strongman regimes. Leaders like Gaddafi in Libya, Mubarak in Egypt, and Ben Ali in Tunisia have all been overthrown. Yet, the Assad family regime in Syria has endured these revolutionary waves and remains in power. This raises a crucial question: what has allowed it to survive? Even more astonishing is that Syria, under the Assad family's rule, has likely faced the most Western hostility and remains at the epicenter of revolutionary upheaval. In 1949, an 18-year-old wealthy Syrian named Abdul Fattah Chandri left his homeland and traveled to Beirut to attend the American University of Beirut. Instead of focusing on his studies, he joined his classmates in anti-Israel protests. During one heated protest, he was jailed. Among his fellow prisoners was George Habash, who later founded the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, the second largest faction within the PLO after Fatah. Had circumstances been different, Chandri might have founded or joined a similar organization. However, 5 years after his arrest, he moved to the United States and planted a seed that would change the world. Since the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire had been in decline, leading to internal divisions. The Greater Syria region, which includes present-day Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, and Palestine, attracted Western powers. By the 1860s, even Americans had arrived. The American University of Beirut, where Chandri studied, was founded by American missionaries in 1866. Initially registered in New York State, it was originally called the Syrian Protestant College before being renamed in 1920. The university's teaching language was English, embedding Western values naturally. Today, it remains a bastion of Westernization, with 70% of its students being Lebanese with foreign nationalities. Conservative Lebanese people view the school as a hub for traders. During the Civil War from 1975 to 1990, the university's president was kidnapped, and its administrative building was bombed. Lebanon has been in turmoil for years, and many citizens dream of emigrating. There's even a saying, no matter how small a country is, there are always Lebanese people there. It's not that they don't love their country, but it's hard to survive in a place ravaged by war for so long. When World War I broke out, the British fought the Ottoman Empire. The British, being cunning, incited the Arab Hashemite family, led by the Sharif of Mecca, Hussein bin Ali, to revolt, promising, if you succeed, you can establish an Arab state stretching from Egypt to Syria. In 1916, British spy Thomas Lawrence, embodying the British knack for alliances and diplomacy, assisted Hussein's Hijaz kingdom in declaring independence from the Ottoman Empire. By 1918, Hussein once again collaborated with British forces and seized control of the Greater Syria region, which he allocated to his third son, Faisal, establishing the Kingdom of Syria. Hussein had 3 sons, Ali, Abdullah, and Faisal. The eldest, Ali, inherited the Hijaz kingdom, their original homeland, while the second son, Abdullah, received what is now modern-day Jordan. Initially, both sides were satisfied with the division of land. During World War I, the victorious Western powers secretly drafted the Sykes-Picot Agreement to divide the Ottoman Empire. Under this agreement, Syria and Lebanon were allocated to France, while Jordan went to Britain, and Palestine was designated for self-governance. Consequently, Faisal's reign as king was short-lived as his territory was transformed into a Western colony. Unhappy with this outcome, Faisal went to the Paris Peace Conference to protest. Lawrence, who had previously assisted Faisal's family, accompanied him to Paris in traditional Arab attire, but their efforts were in vain. Feeling betrayed by the Western powers, Lawrence later refused to accept a knighthood from King George V. By 1923, the Ottoman Empire had completely disintegrated. Various Arab nations within the former empire declared independence, leading to internal divisions among the Arabs. The Hijaz kingdom, controlled by Hussein and passed to his eldest son Ali, went to war with the Nejd, led by Ibn Saud. Due to British betrayal, Hussein fell out with the British, who then supported Ibn Saud. Consequently, Hussein was defeated, and in 1924, the Hijaz was annexed by the Nejd, forming what is now Saudi Arabia. However, a portion of the Hijaz, specifically the Aqaba region, was not annexed and instead ceded to British-controlled Transjordan, governed by Hussein's second son, Abdullah. After World War II, when Britain withdrew from Transjordan, it became the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan. Returning to the Greater Syria region, the Western powers assigned Faisal to rule Iraq to manage the unrest in British-controlled Iraq. For Greater Syria, the Western powers applied their classic strategy of divide and rule, leading to Syria and Lebanon, originally under French control, slowly splitting into two independent countries. After prolonged negotiations and struggles, the French finally left in 1946, and Syria and Lebanon officially gained independence. Although Syria and Lebanon had once been a single entity, Syria continued to meddle in Lebanon's affairs, maintaining a prolonged military presence. When Chanley attended the American University of Beirut in 1949, it didn't feel like he was studying abroad. His plan was to finish his studies there and then return to Damascus University to study law. However, his authoritarian father objected, saying, "There are too many lawyers in Syria." This disagreement prompted Chanley to seek further education in the United States. Despite receiving a Western education, Chanley, like many Arab youths of his time, had a strong sense of pan-Arabism, the belief that all Arabs are one family. In 1952, the fervent pan-Arabist Nasser overthrew Egypt's decaying Ali dynasty, igniting wild enthusiasm among many Arab youths who believed a pan-Arab state was imminent. Chanley was one of them. Another ardent admirer of Nasser was Hafez al-Assad, born in 1930, a year older than Chanley. Tall with a resolute chin and prominent forehead, Assad joined the Ba'ath Party, a political organization dedicated to Arab unity, at the age of 16. Assad was later recognized as one of the most committed advocates of Arab unity, second only to Nasser. In his youth, he coined the famous phrase, "Arab unity is not just an emotion, it is an eternal truth." However, after World War II, the onset of the Cold War brought unprecedented changes to the Middle East. The lofty ideals of pan-Arabism faced harsh realities. Nonetheless, the young people of Greater Syria courageously stepped onto the stage of life, either founding nations, revolting, or leaving their homeland. In 1953, Chanley traveled to the United States for further studies. His father, a wealthy businessman from Homs, Syria, owned several enterprises and had enough influence to affect local wheat prices. This ensured Chanley had no concerns about tuition fees. He first attended Columbia University before transferring to the University of Wisconsin to pursue a PhD in political science. Despite these opportunities, he was never content. In the summer of 1954, Chanley became involved with an American girl named Joanne, who came from a conservative German Catholic rural family in Wisconsin. Her strict father, who ran a mink farm, was furious when he discovered that Joanne was pregnant out of wedlock and intended to marry a Syrian Muslim. He threatened to disown her, making the pregnancy problematic for the young couple. At that time, Joanne's father was gravely ill. In her Catholic community, obtaining an abortion was extremely difficult. The United States had not yet undergone the cultural revolution led by Elvis Presley and remained a conservative society that upheld traditional gender roles. The distressed couple was at a loss for what to do. During the 1954 holiday, Chanley took Joanne back to Homs, Syria. In 1954, 8 years after Syria had gained independence from French colonial rule, Joanne learned to cook Syrian dishes and received many gifts. The city had not yet been devastated by tank treads, but the political scene remained turbulent. Frequent coups led to ongoing instability in Syria and across the Arab world. That same year, Nasser was elected president of Egypt, and the fervor for pan-Arabism reached its peak. Following his election, Nasser led Egypt and several other Arab nations in relentless struggles against Israel. However, these efforts ended in failure. The 1967 Six-Day War was a devastating blow. Egypt lost the Sinai Peninsula, Syria lost the Golan Heights, and Israel took control of the West Bank, Jerusalem, and Gaza Strip. Unable to bear the defeat, Nasser died from overwork and grief on September 28, 1970, at age 52. This marked an unprecedented low for pan-Arabism, further fragmenting the already disunited Arab nations and leading to internal conflicts and warfare. Nearly 400,000 Palestinians became refugees, scattered across Jordan, Lebanon, and other neighboring countries. In 1970, the Palestine Liberation Organization, PLO, used Jordan as a base for guerrilla warfare against Israel, leading to severe retaliation and conflict within Jordan. King Hussein of Jordan, displeased with the situation, sought to expel the PLO. However, the PLO refused to leave, establishing a state within a state around the refugee camps. They labeled the pro-peace King Hussein as an imperialist lackey and even called Nasser a traitor. Tensions escalated dramatically on September 6, 1970, when the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, PFLP, a more radical faction within the PLO founded by George Habash, turned to terrorism. They hijacked 3 planes, taking over 300 Western passengers hostage, and landed them in Jordan. The crisis worsened when the planes were destroyed in the desert, leading to the conflict known as Black September. Assad was nearly expelled from the highest decision-making body during this period. Interestingly, Assad and Jadid had been close associates in earlier years. During a military upheaval, Jadid was detained and faced severe consequences, but Assad intervened and secured his release. However, Jadid later turned against Assad, causing him significant anxiety. Overwhelmed, Assad became highly agitated and sought support within the military. In 1969, he dismissed the head of the National Security Bureau, Jundi, due to accusations against him. Jundi refused to comply and declared his intent to resist, leading to further tension. Jundi was assertive and insisted on a firm stance, warning, "If you don't comply, there will be significant repercussions." Ultimately, Jundi experienced extreme distress. In 1970, during the conflict between the PLO and Jordan, President Jadid ordered troops to support the PLO, but Assad, who controlled the military, firmly responded, "I do not agree." Jadid was so enraged that he turned purple. In November of that year, during a conference, he pressured Assad to step down again. This time, Assad, leveraging his significant influence, decided not to remain passive and sent forces to surround the main government building, resulting in Jadid's confinement until 1998. This event was later known as the Rectification Movement, while Assad referred to it as the Corrective Movement. From that point, Syria entered the Assad era. Born in October 1930 to a farming family in Latakia province, Syria, Assad was part of the Alawite sect within Shia Islam. The Alawites are a very small sect in Syria, making up about 12% of the population, while 80% are Sunni. Since the 10th century, Sunni clerics have considered the Alawites heretical, often stating they are worse than Jews. Historically, Alawites faced discrimination and oppression, often working as servants and laborers without land. After World War I, their situation began to improve. The French, aiming to better control Syria, not only created Lebanon but also established an Alawite autonomous region. Additionally, the French recruited heavily from the local population to form the military. The Sunni, however, were reluctant to join the military, especially under colonial rule, while the low-status Alawites saw it as an opportunity. As a result, 3 out of the 8 regiments formed by the French were Alawite. By the time Syria gained independence in 1946, it was too late for the Sunni to change the situation. The Alawites had already taken control of the Syrian military leadership. This party later expanded to several countries, with Saddam Hussein, who ruled Iraq for many years, also being a member. Initially, Assad aspired to study medicine, but his family's financial constraints led him to enroll at the tuition-free Homs military academy. There, he excelled and was selected to train on Soviet MiG jets. Through perseverance and by navigating Syria's frequent coups, Hafez al-Assad rose to become Syria's Minister of Defense in 1966 and ultimately overthrew Sulh-Jadid to seize power in 1970. Once in power, Assad established a lengthy period of autocratic rule, ending nearly 30 years of political turmoil and coups in Syria, and ushering in a relatively stable era of governance. While Syria moved toward stability, the relationship between Chanley and Joan faced challenges. In 1954, they decided not to marry due to a dilemma. However, in February of the following year, they secretly had a child and asked the delivery doctor to find a couple in San Francisco to adopt the baby. The couple, Paul and Clara, had not graduated from high school. Joan initially wanted the adoptive parents to have a college education, which made her hesitate in signing the adoption papers for several weeks. Concerned about the child's future, she insisted on a written agreement to establish a fund for the child's college education. Perhaps it was fate. Clara, one half of the adoptive couple, was of Armenian descent, and like Chanley, her ancestors had also lived under the Ottoman Empire. Although Paul and Clara had not attended college, they both worked diligently during World War II. Despite their modest means, they were honest and dedicated individuals willing to do anything for the child. Before Joan signed the adoption papers, they had already named the child Stephen Paul Jobs. Later, Joanne did marry Chanley, and in the third year of their marriage, they had another child named Mona. As Joanne's father had predicted, the marriage lasted only until 1962. After the divorce, Chanley disappeared without a trace. Joan remarried, but by 1970, she was once again a single mother. She moved to Los Angeles with her daughter Mona. Meanwhile, Jobs had completely lost touch with his birth family, not knowing their names or whereabouts. 6 years later, he founded Apple. In February 1982, under Assad's orders, his brother Rifat led a force of 12,000 troops to besiege the city. The operation, which lasted nearly a month, resulted in significant casualties. The origins of this massacre trace back to the early years of Assad's rule. In 1963, Assad's Ba'ath party seized power, promoting a secular ideology of unity, freedom, and socialism, effectively ending Syria's semi-divided state. Other political parties and social organizations were banned, but some groups, particularly the Muslim Brotherhood, continued to resist and engage in anti-government struggles. The Muslim Brotherhood, originally founded in Egypt by elementary school teacher Hassan al-Banna, is an Islamist organization known for its involvement in uprisings and riots. After Assad came to power in 1970, the Brotherhood's anti-government efforts intensified. This was because Assad continued to follow a secular path and pursued pragmatic diplomacy, which was in direct opposition to the Brotherhood's Islamist ideology. In 1973, Assad consolidated party, governmental, and legal powers under a new constitution. The first large-scale protest initiated by the Muslim Brotherhood led to increased government measures to appease the situation. Despite these efforts, tensions escalated, leading to numerous casualties and significant civilian losses due to indiscriminate and disproportionate aerial bombardment and shelling. In 1976, Lebanon descended into civil war, involving three main factions: Christians, Phalangists or Maronites, Muslims, and the exiled Palestine Liberation Organization, PLO. Assad, a proponent of pan-Arabism with strong Greater Syria ambitions, believed Syria, Lebanon, and Palestine were inherently one nation. Thus, when the Lebanese civil war erupted, he saw an opportunity to intervene forcefully. Initially, he sided with the Christians to combat the PLO and Muslims. This move angered the Muslim Brotherhood, who argued that although Assad was a Shia, he was still a Muslim, and supporting Christians was a betrayal, labeling him a traitor and a pawn for Israel. They called for a jihad to overthrow Assad. This time, the Brotherhood was better organized, with well-equipped, financially strong, and well-trained military units, some trained abroad, including in the Soviet Union. The Brotherhood also received support from several Muslim countries, such as Jordan, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt, as well as from Israel and the United States. The US and Israel wanted to control Lebanon, and Assad's intervention hindered their plans. They hoped a conflict between Assad and the Brotherhood would allow them to benefit from the chaos. By 1980, the Muslim Brotherhood had significantly expanded, forming an anti-government Islamic front in Syria. This front included not only religious extremists but also many urban middle-class individuals frustrated with government corruption, incompetence, and the economic decline caused by the civil war. It united both left-wing and right-wing elements, as well as supporters of the PLO and pro-Jihad factions. During this period, Assad's reputation in the Muslim world plummeted. The Islamic Front's publication, Victory, labeled him a serpent, a villain, and a lion in Lebanon but a rabbit in the Golan. By 1979, high-ranking Alawite officials, including those in the military command, Ba'ath Party offices, and intelligence agencies, were frequently targeted for assassination. Even Assad's personal physician, advisors, and the commander of the missile forces were killed. In June 1979, holy warriors attacked the Aleppo artillery school, killing 60 Alawite cadets. This violent act was one among many, as the conflict spread nationwide, creating a state of near-constant upheaval. To confront the challenges posed by the Brotherhood and its allies, Rifat issued a stern warning and made extensive preparations. Reports indicated that severe measures were used, affecting not only detainees but also their families. Between 1980 and February 1982, at least 6 major operations were conducted, with the Hama incident being one of the most significant. For instance, during an operation in Palmyra prison, 600 to 1,000 individuals were killed in a single day. By 1981, Rifat's harsh crackdowns had quelled uprisings nationwide, except in Hama, where the Brotherhood remained defiant. On February 2, 1982, around 500 militants stormed key buildings in Hama, killing approximately 250 officials, including high-ranking ones, and besieging the city for 10 days. In response, Assad ordered a comprehensive crackdown on Hama. The result was devastating, with significant damage to the city and many innocent people suffering severe consequences. Anyone suspected of connections to the Brotherhood faced brutal repercussions. The Hama incident left a lasting psychological impact and is remembered as a highly significant event in the ruling family's history. Years later, Western observers described the situation as extremely harsh, coining the term Hama rules to signify a lack of regulations. This major event ended the internal chaos in Syria but also led many Syrians to flee due to the regime's actions. In November 1983, despite the unrest, Assad was temporarily incapacitated by heart disease and diabetes. Unable to manage all affairs personally, he had to delegate more power to his trusted aides. This shift in power dynamics encouraged those eyeing his position to make their moves, with his brother Rifat being the most ambitious. By early 1982, some military figures had already shown rebellious tendencies. At the height of the Brotherhood's activities, a general and several colonels gathered 140 officers and pilots to stage a small-scale coup. Although it failed, it still shook people's confidence in Assad. In the summer of 1982, a significant incident during the internal conflict in Lebanon had substantial effects on military assets. Additionally, the economy was in trouble. During the first 10 years of Assad's rule, the economy had performed well, with an average growth rate of 13.4%, an annual per capita income growth rate of 8.6%, and an industrial annual growth rate that significantly contributed to the country's development. Since Syria's intervention in the Lebanese Civil War in 1976, its military expenses have surged. Coupled with plummeting oil prices and isolation by Western and some Arab countries, Syria experienced inflation rates exceeding 30% from 1979 to 1983. The 1980s saw 8 consecutive years of fiscal deficits, with per capita GDP falling by 15% between 1982 and 1987, and living standards plummeting by 37%. When the economy falters, trouble isn't far behind. As the saying goes, when it rains, it pours. In 1983, when news of Assad's illness surfaced, Rifat, as the commander of the Damascus Defense Forces, took advantage of the situation. He deployed significant military forces within the city and began replacing Assad's photos in public places with his own. Even before his brother's death, Rifat seemed eager to seize power. Some of Assad's loyal relatives and senior Jamaah members, despite their limited resources, tried to dissuade Rifat from his power grab. The situation escalated into clashes near the presidential palace, becoming quite chaotic. However, Rifat, emboldened by his success in quelling the Muslim Brotherhood uprising, ignored all warnings. Assad knew his brother well, aware of Rifat's impulsive and power-hungry nature. Before falling into a coma, he had arranged for a 6-person committee, excluding Rifat, to take over his responsibilities. Yet, with Assad's fate uncertain, many in the court feared that if he died, power might slip away from the Assad family, possibly falling into the hands of the Sunnis. Given Rifat's military successes, they supported his early bid for power. Thus, the Assad regime faced its most severe internal crisis since its inception. This exposed the biggest flaw in its system of governance, which relied heavily on loyalists. Just as the regime was on the brink of collapse, a miracle occurred. In March 1984, Assad, who had been in a coma, suddenly regained consciousness, as if sensing the threat to his power. Furious upon learning of Rifat's betrayal, Assad immediately went to his brother's headquarters and rebuked him. "Are you trying to overthrow the state?" "I am the state. Assad is Syria." With that declaration, Rifat, like a mouse before a cat, fell silent. The gravest internal rebellion in Syria's history was thus dramatically quelled. Assad swiftly reorganized the government, stripping Rifat of his military power and assigning him a ceremonial vice-presidential role. He conducted a thorough purge of the military, removing all officers involved in the rebellion without mercy. Assad even contemplated executing his troublesome brother, but their mother's tearful pleas softened his heart. In 1985, Rifat was exiled to Europe, stripped of any real power. However, his ambition was not entirely extinguished, and he would pose a significant threat to the Assad regime in the future. After a severe illness, Assad seemed to have aged 10 years overnight, appearing frail with a paralyzed left arm and impaired vision. However, upon regaining his position, Syria's economy began to show signs of improvement, with growth rates reaching 8% in the early 1990s. It's important to note that the 1983 rebellion coincided with a new phase of the Cold War. For years earlier, the Soviet Union had invaded Afghanistan, becoming mired in a decade-long conflict. These events indicated that the proxy wars of the Cold War between the US and the Soviet Union were shifting from Vietnam, the Korean Peninsula, and East Asia to the Middle East and Central Asia. This shift suggested that new turmoil was likely to befall the region. While an ironclad system could suppress internal chaos, unrest originating from outside posed a different challenge. However, this lofty ideal was constantly challenged by the harsh reality of the Golan Heights being occupied by Israel for years. Unable to secure his own national sovereignty, how could Assad dream of uniting the entire Arab region? Nevertheless, he never backed down, leading to many troubles and dangers. Assad was the most fervent advocate of this idea. Assad once declared that Lebanon and Palestine did not exist, only Greater Syria. Despite being a small country unable to manage its own affairs, Syria harbored grand and unrealistic ambitions. This is Syria and this is Assad. In 1975, a civil war broke out in Lebanon, similar to the Jordanian Civil War in 1970. After the Third Middle East War in 1967, the PLO lost its base and scattered to surrounding countries, causing further turmoil. In Lebanon, the Christian Maronites sought to expel the PLO, while the Sunni Muslims supported it, leading to conflict. Seizing this as an opportunity to pursue his Greater Syria dream, Assad dispatched 35,000 troops to occupy northern Lebanon. Interestingly, Assad initially backed the Maronites, possibly due to personal grudges against PLO leader Arafat, whom he saw as an ineffective leader for the Palestinian cause. The deeper reason was that the PLO was largely shunned by many Arab countries at the time. Assad's support for the Christians ignited a Syrian uprising led by the Muslim Brotherhood, culminating in the Hama massacre. Whether this was worth it is a question only Assad could answer. The situation became more complex in September 1976 when the Maronite faction won the Lebanese presidency, leading to clashes between Assad and the Maronites. Israel's intervention in the Lebanese Civil War in 1982, which triggered the Fifth Arab-Israeli War, and the subsequent establishment of Hezbollah with Iranian support, forced Assad to abandon cooperation. This shows that while Assad had ambitions for both Greater Syria and Pan-Arabism, he was willing to sacrifice the former if it conflicted with the latter. From 1982 to 1990, during the Lebanese Civil War, Israel and its Christian allies initially gained the upper hand, installing a hardline Christian president, Bashir Gemayel, who was later assassinated. In retaliation, Israeli leader Sharon, in collaboration with the Christian Phalange, stormed Beirut refugee camps, leading to the infamous Sabra and Shatila massacre. This massacre received extensive media coverage and became a turning point in the Fifth Arab-Israeli War. As a result, Israel and its Western backers faced even fiercer attacks. In April and October 1983, the U.S. and French embassies in Lebanon, along with the peacekeeping headquarters, were severely bombed, causing nearly 300 American and 58 French casualties. These heavy losses led to a strategic pullback by the U.S. under Reagan's administration. By 1990, Iraq's invasion of Kuwait shifted much of the Western focus. The last pro-Israel Christian Lebanese president, Michel Aoun, was finally ousted by Syrian-backed Shia forces. This marked the end of the 15-year Lebanese Civil War, which claimed 140,000 lives, concluding under Syrian dominance. After the Civil War, Hezbollah grew stronger, and Assad's over 30,000 troops remained in Lebanon until 2005. That year, the assassination of former Lebanese Prime Minister Hariri prompted Syria to announce a withdrawal. However, this did not change Syria's long-term control over Lebanon, and Israel's forces only fully withdrew in 2000. From this perspective, Syria did gain some advantages from the Lebanese Civil War, at least until 1990, holding an upper hand over Israel and the West. The underlying reason is clear. At that time, the Soviet Union was the only force countering the West, and Assad leveraged the Cold War dynamics between the US and the USSR. During the early stages of the Lebanese Civil War, Assad sided with the Christian Maronites, which drew criticism from the Soviet Union. Brezhnev even wrote to him, accusing him of betraying a friend. Assad ignored this criticism and instead sought support from the US and Israel. When pressured, he threatened to revoke the Soviet Navy's access to Tartus port. Fearing Syria's complete shift to the west, the Soviet Union turned a blind eye. In 1977, when Carter took office, Assad began to strengthen ties with the United States, and their relationship grew quite warm. The Americans supported him, seeing him as the only one capable of stabilizing the chaos in Lebanon. As Assad moved closer to the west, the Soviet Union grew increasingly anxious about losing its influence. Surprisingly, Syria's initial invasion of Lebanon received support from both the United States and the Soviet Union. This dual backing was essential for Assad to occupy and control northern Lebanon. However, the question remained, how long could Assad sustain this strategy of playing the US-Soviet rivalry without it backfiring? In 1973, Egyptian President Sadat, continuing Nasser's legacy, used Soviet military aid to lead a coalition of Arab states, including Syria, in a significant strike against Israel. This war allowed the Arab side to regain some lost territories. Egypt reclaimed the Sinai Peninsula, and Syria recovered 663 square kilometers, including the city of Quneitra. However, after achieving his strategic goals, Sadat shifted his stance, seeking reconciliation with Israel despite unresolved issues in the West Bank and the Golan Heights. This shift had severe repercussions, leading to the complete disintegration of the Arab military and political alliance formed under Nasser's leadership. As a result, Syria's hopes of reclaiming the Golan Heights and establishing a Palestinian state became increasingly remote. Sadat paid the ultimate price for his decisions. In October 1981, he was assassinated by religious extremists during a military parade. During the Fourth Arab-Israeli War, Assad led Syria with full force, deploying hundreds of aircraft, 140 artillery battalions, and 3 infantry divisions to support Sadat's assault on Israel. This offensive inflicted significant damage on Israel and temporarily recaptured much of the Golan Heights. Israel's counterattack nearly reached Damascus, coming within just 34 kilometers of the city. Assad, who had risked national survival to support Sadat, viewed Sadat's actions as a betrayal. Despite this, Sadat proceeded on his own. In 1977, he visited Israel and, alongside Israeli Prime Minister Begin, declared, "No more war, no more threats, no more aggression." In response, Assad quickly formed the Rejectionist Front, with 4 other Arab states and the PLO, branding Sadat a national traitor and marking Sadat's visit to Israel as a day of national mourning. In 1974, Assad attempted to bypass Egypt by allying with several wealthy Arab nations to wage a war of attrition against Israel. However, as a small nation with limited resources, Syria found its allies quickly retreating, forcing Assad to fight alone. Henry Kissinger remarked, "Assad is emotional and full of idealistic notions. Without sufficient power to support his dreams, those dreams verged on delusion." The more troublesome issue arose when Sadat, ignoring the opposition of other Arab nations, signed the Camp David Accords. This not only led Assad to oppose Sadat but also caused him to sever any ties with the West, leading him to fully realign with the Soviet Union. In 1977, Assad visited the Soviet Union and began to align more closely with Palestinian organizations and Muslim groups within Lebanon to counterbalance Western influence. This shift resulted in the Assad regime facing unprecedented pressure from the West. The United States and its allies conducted numerous covert operations to undermine Assad's government. A declassified CIA memorandum from July 1986, which surfaced online in recent years, detailed a plan to overthrow the Syrian regime, clearly illustrating the intense hostility the U.S. held towards Assad. As a lion, Assad was far from passive. He skillfully used his political acumen to prevent any reconciliation between his co-sectarians and the Sunni majority. Domestically, he enforced harsh suppression policies to maintain stability, continuing a violent campaign against protesters even in the presence of monitoring delegations. Internationally, Assad had no choice but to recall Bashar from London to take his deceased brother's place. Bashar, then just 34 years old, had recently ascended to the presidency following his father's death. His father gave him almost no time to catch his breath or hesitate. Upon returning to Syria, Bashar had to quickly exchange his suit for a military uniform. He reported to the Homs Military Academy and was immediately promoted to lieutenant colonel. Why the rush? The answer is simple. Syria's situation was dire, complicated by the involvement of other countries and organized fighters. 3 years before Basil's death, the collapse of the Soviet Union had left Syria without its major backer. Concurrently, Syria was in a standoff with the West, embroiled in complex geopolitical struggles. Additionally, the end of the Iran-Iraq War and the eruption of the Gulf War accelerated the fragmentation of the Arab world. Assad not only lost the Soviet Union as a major supporter but also the backing of other Arab allies. In the year the Soviet Union collapsed, the United States initiated the Madrid peace talks, compelling Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, and the PLO to negotiate territorial disputes with Israel. Consequently, Israel capitalized on the disunity among Arab nations, reaching the Oslo Accords with the PLO in 1993 and making peace with Jordan in 1994, which further isolated Syria. No one grasped the danger of the situation better than Assad, a shrewd politician and adept strategist. Even a minor misstep could spell Syria's downfall, as the region was already unstable and economically declining. Complicating matters, Assad's health worsened around the time of Basil's death due to heart disease and diabetes, exacerbated by the grief of losing his son. 10 years earlier, his brother Rifat had attempted a coup when Assad was ill. In 1992, Rifat returned to Syria from exile and was named vice president, though without actual power. After Basil's death, many feared history might repeat itself. Despite these challenges, a strong economy might have given the regime some respite. Unfortunately, during those years, Syria's economy was particularly weak due to heavy spending on the Lebanese civil war. From 1990 to 1994, defense spending consumed 54.5% of Syria's total expenditure. In such a critical period, how could Assad find any peace? This urgency explains why Assad was so eager to recall Bashar and position him in power. At that time, Assad was nearly at his wits' end, even seeking favor with the West. He began permitting newspapers to mention Israel by name, and Israeli leaders started appearing on Syrian television. Despite his illness, he traveled to Egypt, a country he had previously criticized for betraying, to seek support from an old ally. Luckily, Egypt was then governed by Mubarak, Assad's old classmate from the Air Force Academy, which improved relations and spared Assad from losing face. By 1999, Assad knew his time was limited due to his declining health and began preparing his son Bashar to succeed him. Around this period, Israel's prime minister announced plans to withdraw troops from Lebanon, increasing pressure on Syria to do the same. The international community demanded the withdrawal of all foreign military forces that had entered Lebanon during its civil war to restore the country's sovereignty. If Israel withdrew, Syria, which still had troops stationed there, would face immense international pressure. With little time left, Assad looked at his son Bashar, who was not yet of legal age to become president, feeling utterly lost and unsure of what to do. In his final moments, Assad made several last-minute arrangements to ensure the transfer of power. He replaced 23 out of 35 ministers with new faces and dismissed the prime minister who might threaten his son's succession. 2 weeks after the Israeli withdrawal from Lebanon, Assad, filled with anxiety, collapsed due to a sudden heart attack. Just hours before his death, he was still on the phone with the Lebanese president, explaining why Syria had not yet withdrawn its troops and seeking support for his inexperienced son, Bashar. In 2000, Bashar was only 34 years old. According to the Syrian constitution, presidential candidates had to be at least 40 years old. However, the parliament, controlled by Assad loyalists, amended the constitution within 2 hours of Assad's death, lowering the minimum age for presidential candidates to 34. Rifat, known for his insatiable ambition, criticized the move as a stab in the back of the Syrian constitution, signifying the end of the legitimacy of the presidency. He even collaborated with the Syrian Muslim Brotherhood in exile in the UK, aiming to overthrow Bashar's regime. Consequently, one of Bashar's first actions after taking power was to issue an arrest warrant for his uncle. Acting President Qadim, loyal to Assad, quickly promoted the new leader from colonel to general and appointed him commander-in-chief of the Syrian army. 10 days later, he helped Bashar become the general secretary of the Ba'ath Party. By July 2000, Bashar was officially inaugurated with 97.29% of the vote. The transition process, filled with tension, took about a month but was ultimately successful. However, ascending to power is difficult. Maintaining it is even more challenging. By the time Bashar took the throne, Syria had entered a new historical phase. The Soviet Union, its major backer, had disintegrated, and the Arab League, once led by Egypt, was now a shadow of its former self. Accompanying this shift was what Huntington described as the third wave of democratization. This wave began in 1974 in Portugal, swept through Latin America and East Asia in the 1980s, and reached other regions by the 2000s. By then, it was forcefully impacting North Africa, the Middle East, and Central Asia. As a typical Arab autocratic regime, Bashar's Syria faced the dilemma of Western sanctions from the outset. Assad had left behind chemical weapons and radical Palestinian organizations in Damascus, providing further justification for these sanctions. Israeli planes even bombed Syrian territory for the first time in 20 years. Even Syria's legitimate claim to the Golan Heights received little international support. By the year 2000, Syria had a population of 16.32 million and a GDP of only $17.33 billion. In stark contrast, in 1981, with a population of just 9.05 million, the GDP was already $15.5 billion. This comparison highlights that Syria's economy had stagnated for nearly 2 decades, showing little to no improvement. Newly ascended to power, Bashar al-Assad faced the daunting task of addressing this complex situation, with the world seemingly poised to watch him fail. During his university years, Bashar was deeply passionate about dentistry. Syrians often praised his simplicity as his greatest strength. He had a Western education, spoke fluent English and French, and was enthusiastic about the internet, mobile phones, and photography. Despite his modern inclinations, Bashar was politically inexperienced, having only led the Computer Association, which introduced the internet to Syria. He was acutely aware of his limited political experience. Upon taking office, Bashar prioritized economic development and aimed to win over the West. In 2001, he and Asma made their first public appearance together, welcoming the Bulgarian president. Asma, a Sunni, did not wear a headscarf and dressed fashionably, making a strong impression. Western media praised her highly. Born in London in 1975, Asma holds dual British and Syrian citizenship. Asma's family comes from the Sunni community in Homs, Syria. Despite her background, she defied traditional norms by marrying Bashar, a member of the Alawite sect, an offshoot of Shia Islam. A graduate of the prestigious Queen's College in London, she holds degrees in French literature and computer science. Before marriage, she worked in Western investment banking, already embodying a Western lifestyle. To curry favor with the West, Bashar introduced reforms to expand freedom of speech, reduce the role of state-owned enterprises, and increase political participation. Initially, these efforts were well received in the West. His wife Asma, a Sunni Muslim born and educated in Britain, was initially celebrated in the Western press as a rose in the desert. She gained popularity and was featured in magazines like LLE and Vogue, earning titles such as the Diana of the Middle East and the Desert Rose. During this time, Bashar's fortunes seemed favorable. The 9/11 attacks in 2001 shifted Western focus to Afghanistan and Iraq, reducing pressure on him. In his early years, Bashar faced less scrutiny, and the Western media even coined the term Damascus Spring to describe his reforms. However, this period of relative calm was short-lived. The mild-mannered new ruler soon faced an unsolvable paradox. Saddam Hussein, born in 1937, became president of Iraq in 1979 at age 42, leading the Ba'ath Party. He was 7 years younger than Assad, and both were part of the same political movement. Their predecessor, Bakr, had connections to Assad, making them contemporaries among the generation of Middle Eastern strongmen that emerged during the Cold War. Like other leaders of his era, Saddam skillfully navigated between the US and the Soviet Union, leveraging both sides to his advantage. When he took office in 1979 and during his campaign against Iran, he even received support from the US. However, after the Soviet Union collapsed, Saddam failed to recognize the changing international dynamics and chose to confront the West directly, which proved disastrous. His capture in 2003 and execution in 2006 were essentially predetermined from the moment he invaded Kuwait in 1990. Saddam's downfall sent shockwaves through the ranks of Middle Eastern strongmen, instilling fear among them. After his demise, a wave of regime collapses swept the region, affecting countries like Tunisia, Libya, Yemen, Sudan, Egypt, Georgia, and Ukraine. This series of events, known as the Arab Spring, toppled leaders one after another. In this turbulent context, Assad's political savvy stood out. While Saddam still dreamed of dominating the Gulf region after the Soviet Union's collapse, Assad had already begun making strategic adjustments. He courted the West and scaled back his expansionist ambitions. When Bashar al-Assad took power in 2000, he continued his father's strategy, despite its risks, as it was the only viable path for their regime's survival. Bashar initially aimed to maintain friendly relations with the West, but issues like the sovereignty of the Golan Heights made this impossible. When the US captured Saddam in 2003, Bashar strongly opposed it. In response, the US imposed sanctions on Syria, citing its support for terrorism and its influence in Lebanon. In 2005, after the assassination of Lebanese Prime Minister Hariri, Bashar announced the withdrawal of Syrian troops from Lebanon, but the US continued its sanctions. Bashar's series of Western-style reforms did not bring stability but instead sparked internal turmoil. His efforts to promote freedom of speech and expand political participation led to subversive activities by intellectuals. Bashar's economic reforms aimed at transitioning from a planned economy to a market economy modeled after China's resulted in rapid economic growth, but also increased wealth inequality. After the Damascus Spring in 2001, Bashar had to use force to suppress various dissenting groups. During this period of relaxed control, the Kurds in the northeast began to stir in 2004, leading to an uprising and forcing Bashar to suppress them again. Conservative factions and vested interests within the old regime, whose benefits were compromised by Bashar's reforms, shifted from staunch loyalty to outright opposition. Many of these opponents were once his father's most loyal ministers, including Khattam, the former acting president who had helped Bashar ascend to power in 2000, only to later turn against him. Bashar was left bewildered. His sincere efforts towards national progress and reform had led to internal and external crises and widespread betrayal. It seemed as if he had opened Pandora's box, unleashing forces intent on his downfall. Bashar faced a common challenge in the modernization of developing countries. The process involves economic, political, and social opening, essentially decentralizing power. The paradox is that decentralizing power often leads to weakness and instability in the regime, making effective modernization difficult. For example, when Bashar weakened the power of the old guard within the Ba'ath Party, these loyalists to his father had initially been instrumental in securing his rise to power. Over time, they entrenched themselves with numerous loyalists, becoming significant obstacles to societal progress. Thus, reform and power reduction were necessary. Bashar removed about 60% of these old ministers from the Ba'ath Party, parliament, and government, replacing them with younger professionals. While this made the country more modern, it also led to a crisis of hollowness within the Assad regime, weakening its authority. Consequently, various tribal, religious, and ethnic conflicts erupted, making the path to reform increasingly difficult. As Huntington noted, Modernity breeds stability, but the process of modernization breeds chaos. Similar to the Tunisian Revolution, the Syrian crisis was ignited by a seemingly random event. On March 6, 2011, security forces detained 15 youths for painting anti-government graffiti. The crackdown was severe, with some youths facing brutal treatment and the mothers of 9 boys being targeted. By mid-2012, the crisis had escalated into a full-blown civil war, with fighting spreading nationwide and fatalities mounting at unprecedented rates. As the conflict erupted, anti-government forces in Syria emerged from all directions, akin to a disturbed hornet's nest. These included separatist movements in Kurdish areas, tribal leaders, and exiled politicians. Defectors from the Syrian military formed their own faction, notably the Free Syrian Army. Local coordination committees also appeared, advocating for local autonomy. Public intellectuals, inspired by regional reforms and the crisis, became another significant faction. Various groups of demonstrators were mobilized, driven by reports of violence from security forces. Neighboring Turkey, with its long-standing disputes with Syria over water resources, Kurdish issues, and territorial claims, seized the opportunity presented by Syria's turmoil. Turkey called for Bashar al-Assad to step down and transfer power to opposition groups, including those connected to the Muslim Brotherhood. The West, particularly the United States, made its stance clear, with Obama stating bluntly, "The best solution to the Syrian crisis is for Bashar to step down." Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and other Gulf states echoed this demand, urging Bashar to relinquish power. Both the Arab League and the Organization of Islamic Cooperation suspended Syria's membership. Egypt's new president, Mohamed Morsi, a member of the Muslim Brotherhood, announced a severance of ties with Syria. Lebanon, which had long endured Syria's dominance, watched with quiet satisfaction. Israel, on the other hand, was delighted to see Syria descend into chaos. At the onset of the civil war, the West imposed nearly comprehensive sanctions on Bashar al-Assad's regime. Even his wife, Asma, once celebrated by Western media as the Desert Rose, was now labeled a toxic flower, witch, and shopaholic. Initially, Bashar was apprehensive, advocating for negotiations and admitting that the military's crackdown on protesters was a mistake. However, in 2012, when the United States closed its embassy in Syria and President Obama openly demanded his removal, Bashar realized there was no turning back and decided to stand his ground. Of course, Bashar couldn't have held out on his own. In a twist of fate, international dynamics began to favor him once again. Despite Syria being engulfed in the tidal wave of color revolutions orchestrated by the West, it was this very wave that incubated the international forces ensuring his survival. The most crucial of these forces were Iran and Putin's Russia, while the Kurdish forces and the extremist group ISIS indirectly aided him. Let's break this down. First, Iran, the largest Shia power in the Middle East, naturally aligned with Bashar's regime. Since the 1979 revolution led by Khomeini, which established a theocratic government, Iran had consistently been an adversary of the West and a staunch opponent of Israel. The Gulf War in 1990 and the Afghanistan War in 2001 diverted the West's attention, providing Iran with a prime opportunity for expansion. When the Syrian civil war broke out, Iran stood firmly behind Bashar's regime, offering comprehensive support ranging from military equipment and personnel to economic assistance. Russia also played a critical role. Putin, who rose to power in the aftermath of the Soviet Union's collapse, became a new strongman. When the West directed its color revolutions towards Bashar's regime, Putin found it unacceptable both emotionally and rationally. Moreover, he was dedicated to reviving Russia's influence reminiscent of the Soviet era. This was evident in Russia's support for the Syrian regime to maintain its structure and avoid the chaos seen in Libya. In 2014, after the U.S. provided substantial aid to Syrian opposition forces, particularly the Kurdish militias, under the pretext of fighting ISIS, Russia also stepped in to support the Assad regime. By the end of 2017, the combined efforts of the US and Russia had significantly diminished ISIS's presence in Syria. This inadvertently benefited Bashar, allowing him to reclaim significant territory and secure his hold on power. It was after recapturing Aleppo from opposition forces that Bashar's regime managed to claw its way back from the brink of destruction and gain the upper hand in the civil war. At this point, the US was quite frustrated because its strategic goal was to topple Bashar's regime. However, since ISIS was an extremist terrorist organization, the US found itself in the paradoxical position of having to help one enemy eliminate another. The Kurds are an ancient ethnic group spread across Turkey, Iran, Iraq, and Syria. In the Middle East, their population is second only to Arabs, Turks, and Persians. They have long aspired to establish an independent nation. This aspiration has led Turkey, Iran, and Iraq to oppose any moves by the Syrian Kurds to break away, fearing this might encourage the Kurds within their own borders to do the same. When the US supported the Syrian Kurds, Turkey and Iraq, despite their conflicts with Syria, had no choice but to back the Assad regime. This created an interesting situation. Russia, Turkey, and Iran temporarily united, excluding the US, to launch what they called the Astana process, vowing to ensure the survival of the Assad regime. In conclusion, whether by misfortune or fortune, the Assad regime, although teetering amidst complex international dynamics, has managed to survive precisely because of these intricate international power plays. As of February 2023, the Assad regime controls 63.38% of the country's territory. The Kurds control about 26% of the territory and are now seeking greater autonomy while supporting the Assad government. Opposition forces, which confront the government, control about 11% of the territory. Since the civil war began in 2011, at least 350,000 people have died, including over 22,000 children. Half of Syria's pre-war population of approximately 21.32 million has been displaced, becoming refugees. In 2020, Turkey and Russia, the two main intervening forces, reached a ceasefire agreement that brought relative calm to the major factions within Syria, although conflicts have not entirely ceased. Groups like ISIS no longer control any territory but remain active at the grassroots level. In 2023, the Arab League and the Organization of Islamic Cooperation readmitted Syria, and Saudi Arabia restored diplomatic relations with the country. This marked the end of the Arab world's 13-year exclusion of the Assad regime, recognizing Assad as the victor of the civil war. Last March, China brokered a reconciliation between Saudi Arabia and Iran, sparking a new wave of peace in the Middle East that indirectly benefited Syria. Reports indicate that Assad has even sent his children to study in China. Since 2019, a significant number of Syrian artifacts have been exhibited in China, resembling another gesture of seeking support. Currently, Syria needs more than just weapons and ammunition. It desperately requires broad energy markets, infrastructure, fertilizers, pesticides, and wheat seeds. The peace and security that countless widows, orphans, and refugees long for, a life free from conflict, are also desperately needed. In 1970, after Joan divorced again, she moved to Los Angeles with her daughter Mona, losing contact with jobs and with no trace of Jandali. For over a decade, the family remained separated. In the early 1980s, Jobs became a household name with the release of the Apple II. During this time, he began searching for his biological mother and soon reunited with her. He also discovered that he had a biological sister named Mona Simpson. At that time, Mona was an editor at the renowned Paris Review and an emerging novelist. Her debut work was titled Anywhere, but here, Mona was married to Richard Appel, a writer and producer for The Simpsons. The character Homer Simpson's surname came from Mona, who had taken it from her mother's second husband, George Simpson. After reuniting with their mother, the only one missing was their father, Jandali. Following his divorce from Joanne, Jandali left Wisconsin and spent 2 years as an assistant professor at the University of Nevada, Reno. Finding academia unprofitable, he decided to open a restaurant. Jandali's first restaurant was near the university where he had worked. He later opened branches in Las Vegas, California, Sacramento, and San Jose, all of which were successful. Interestingly, Jobs often dined at Jandali's Mediterranean restaurant in San Jose. They even shook hands and exchanged pleasantries, with Jobs being a generous tipper, but neither knew they were father and son. In 1987, Mona eventually found Jandali, but Jobs was reluctant to meet him, instructing his sister, "Don't mention me to that man." Thus, even after Mona reunited with her father, Jandali still did not know that Jobs was his son. In 2006, Jandali stumbled upon a gossip blog that finally confirmed through Mona that Jobs was his son. However, by then, Jobs had been diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. Respecting his son's wish not to meet, Jandali refrained from calling and sent only brief emails with messages like "Happy birthday" or "Get well soon." Jobs never replied and they never met. In 2011, shortly before Jobs passed away, civil war erupted in his native Syria. When biographer Walter Isaacson asked Jobs if the Obama administration should intervene, Jobs responded almost emotionlessly, "Who knows? If you intervene, it's a mess. If you don't, it's still a mess." After Jobs' death, a wrinkled Jandali used an Apple computer to browse various websites commemorating his son. Seeing photos of the young, hippie genius Jobs, he murmured, "He looks just like I did when I was young." Perhaps Jandali reflected back to 1954, when he was 23 and a fervent admirer of Nasser. Assad, only a year older than Jandali, dedicated his entire life to this cause. As Jobs' final words hinted, despite Syria's independence from Western colonial rule, it has never fully escaped Western influence and continues to grapple with the challenges of reform and modernization. The future of Syria remains uncertain. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe to our channel.